Picture this. You're at your company's annual holiday party, finally feeling like you belong after 3 years of grinding through late nights and weekend projects. Then your boss walks up to you in front of everyone and says something so crushing, so humiliating, that it changes everything. What happened next? Well, let's just say HR got involved, and by the end of it all, I wasn't the one packing my desk. This is that story. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 6 months ago, I was a senior marketing analyst at Redwood Financial Solutions in downtown Phoenix. I'd been there for 3 years, working my way up from an entry-level position, always staying late, always volunteering for extra projects, always believing that hard work would eventually pay off. The company's annual holiday party was held at the Grand Canyon Resort Ballroom, about an hour outside the city. It was December 15th, and I remember the date exactly because it was the night everything changed. The event was supposed to be a celebration of our record-breaking year, complete with awards, bonuses, and what management called appreciation for our incredible team. I'd spent weeks preparing for this party, not just picking out the right dress or doing my hair, but actually preparing professionally. See, there had been whispers about a new director position opening up in the marketing department. Multiple people had hinted that I was being considered, including my direct supervisor, Janet Morrison, who'd been mentoring me for the past year. The ballroom was decorated with silver and gold streamers, round tables covered in crisp white linens, and a small stage where our CEO, Michael Harrison, would later give his annual speech. About 200 employees were there, from various departments across the company. The energy was good, people were relaxed, and for once, it felt like we were all just colleagues enjoying ourselves rather than stressed workers watching the clock. I arrived around 7 p.m. with my colleague and friend Amanda Torres, who worked in the accounting department. We'd coordinated our outfits over text messages for weeks. She wore a navy blue cocktail dress, and I'd chosen a burgundy dress that I'd bought specifically for this event. It sounds silly now, but at the time, it felt important to look the part of someone ready for a promotion. The first few hours went exactly as I'd hoped. I mingled with people from different departments, had meaningful conversations about upcoming projects, and even received compliments from senior staff about my recent work on the Richardson Industries campaign. That campaign had been my baby for 4 months. I'd developed the entire strategy, managed the client relationship, and delivered results that exceeded everyone's expectations by 30%. Around 9:30, after dinner had been served and people were starting to relax with their second or third drinks, I found myself in a conversation with Patricia Kim from HR and David Thompson from the IT department. We were discussing the company's expansion plans for next year when I noticed my boss, Robert Sterling, approaching our group. Robert was the vice president of marketing, a man in his mid-50s who'd been with the company for nearly 15 years. He had salt and pepper hair, always wore expensive suits, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having his authority questioned. In the 3 years I'd worked under him, our relationship had been professional but distant. He acknowledged my work when it was exceptional, ignored me when it was merely good, and had a habit of taking credit for successful campaigns during board meetings. "Sarah," he said, inserting himself into our conversation with the casual authority he always displayed. "I was just talking to Michael about next year's budget allocations." I smiled, hoping this was leading somewhere positive. Maybe this was the moment he'd mention the director position, or at least hint at increased responsibilities coming my way. "You know," he continued, loud enough for not just our small group to hear, but for the neighboring tables to tune in as well, "I've been watching your work these past few months, and I think it's time someone gave you some honest feedback." The tone of his voice made my stomach drop, but I maintained my smile. Patricia and David were still engaged in the conversation, and I could sense other people starting to pay attention to what was happening. "I appreciate any feedback," I said carefully, though something in his demeanor was setting off alarm bells. Robert took a sip of his whiskey and looked directly at me. "The thing is, Sarah, I've seen a lot of young professionals come through this company over the years. Some have what it takes to really make it, to move up and become leaders. Others, he paused, and I could feel the weight of multiple conversations stopping around us. Others are just good enough to stay busy, but they'll never really amount to anything significant here. They lack that special something, the vision, the strategic thinking, the leadership presence that separates the wheat from the chaff. My face felt hot, and I could sense Amanda somewhere behind me, probably frozen in shock. Patricia looked uncomfortable, and David had suddenly found his drink very interesting. But Robert wasn't finished. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, especially at a party, but I think you fall into that second category. You're a solid worker, don't get me wrong. You show up, you complete assignments, you follow directions well, but you'll never amount to anything significant here. You don't have what it takes for real leadership. The ballroom didn't go silent. That only happens in movies. But the conversations around us definitely quieted, and I could feel eyes turning toward our group. Some people were pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, but somehow managed to keep standing there with what I hoped was a neutral expression. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened and figure out how to respond. "I see," I said, my voice somehow steady despite the fact that my hands were shaking. "Thank you for the feedback." Robert nodded as if he'd just done me a favor. "I think it's better to be honest about these things rather than let people harbor unrealistic expectations. You're good at what you do, Sarah. There's no shame in being a reliable analyst." He turned to Patricia and David, smoothly transitioning into a different conversation about the company's new health insurance plans, as if he hadn't just humiliated me in front of half the party. I excused myself and walked toward the bathroom, trying to process what had just happened. The hallway leading to the restrooms was mercifully empty, and I leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to catch my breath. Amanda found me there about 5 minutes later. "Sarah, what the hell was that?" she whispered urgently. "I can't believe he said that to you, especially here, especially tonight." I shook my head, still trying to make sense of it. "I don't know. I thought things were going well. I thought I was being considered for the director position." "You were," Amanda said firmly. "Janet told me just last week that you were the frontrunner. Everyone knows your work on the Richardson campaign was brilliant. Robert's just being—" She struggled for the right word. "Honest?" I suggested bitterly. "No, he's being a jerk, and he did it publicly, which makes it so much worse." We talked for a few more minutes, and Amanda convinced me to go back to the party rather than leaving early, which had been my first instinct. "Don't let him see that he got to you," she advised. "Hold your head up and finish the night." So that's what I did. I returned to the ballroom, engaged in a few more conversations, and even managed to laugh at appropriate moments. But the entire time, I was aware of people looking at me differently, of conversations that stopped when I approached, of the subtle shift in how others were treating me. The party officially ended around 11:30, but people started leaving around 11. I stayed until close to the end, determined not to let Robert think he'd driven me away early. As I was getting my coat from the check, I overheard two managers from the sales department talking. Pretty harsh what Robert said to that marketing girl. Yeah, but maybe it needed to be said. Sometimes people need to hear the truth about their limitations. I grabbed my coat and left without saying goodbye to anyone except Amanda. The drive back to Phoenix gave me an hour and a half to think, and by the time I reached my apartment, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. Not the public humiliation, not the unprofessional manner in which it was delivered, and definitely not the timing, at a company celebration where everyone was supposed to feel valued and appreciated. But I also wasn't going to do anything rash. I'd learned enough about workplace dynamics to know that emotional reactions rarely led to positive outcomes. Instead, I was going to be strategic. The next morning was Saturday, and I spent it researching company policies, reviewing my employee handbook, and documenting everything I could remember about the previous night's events. I wrote down who was present during Robert's comments, what exactly he'd said as precisely as I could recall, and the impact it had on my professional reputation within the company.
I also reviewed my performance evaluations from the past 3 years, my project outcomes, client feedback, and any emails or documents that demonstrated my contributions to the company. What I found was a clear pattern of consistently strong performance, positive feedback from clients and colleagues, and steady increases in responsibility and project complexity. Most importantly, I found something I'd almost forgotten about. 6 months earlier, I'd attended a company-wide training session on workplace conduct and harassment policies. During that session, we'd been specifically told that public humiliation, undermining an employee's professional reputation, and creating hostile work environments were all forms of workplace harassment that the company took seriously.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. By Sunday evening, I had a clear plan. I was going to file a formal complaint with HR, but I was going to do it properly, with documentation, specific policy references, and a clear explanation of how Robert's behavior had violated company standards and potentially damaged my career prospects. Monday morning, I called HR first and asked to schedule a meeting with the director, Patricia Kim, ironically, the same Patricia who had witnessed Robert's comments at the party. When I mentioned that it concerned a workplace conduct issue, she agreed to meet with me that afternoon. The HR department at Redwood Financial was located on the third floor, in a suite of offices that always smelled faintly of coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Patricia's office had a large window overlooking the parking lot, 2 chairs facing her desk, and motivational posters that seemed to have been there since the company opened. Patricia was in her early 40s, with short black hair and a no-nonsense manner that had earned her respect throughout the company. I'd interacted with her several times over the years for routine matters, and she'd always been professional and fair. "Sarah," she said as I sat down in one of the chairs facing her desk, "I have to admit, I was wondering if I'd be hearing from you after Friday night." I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, containing my documented account of events, relevant policy references, and supporting materials about my job performance. "I want to file a formal complaint about Robert Sterling's conduct at the holiday party," I said directly. "What he did was unprofessional, violated company policies, and has already begun affecting my standing with colleagues." Patricia nodded and opened a new file on her computer. "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened, in your own words, from beginning to end." So I did. I told her about the conversation, Robert's specific comments, the public nature of his statements, and the reactions I'd observed from other employees. I also provided her with copies of my performance reviews and project outcomes to demonstrate that his assessment of my capabilities was inconsistent with documented evidence of my work quality. "I see," Patricia said when I finished. She was taking notes on both her computer and a legal pad. "And you're certain about the specific language he used? The phrase about never amounting to anything?" "Absolutely certain, and David Thompson and several other people heard it as well." Patricia was quiet for a moment, reviewing her notes. Finally, she looked up at me. "Sarah, I'm going to be honest with you. What Robert did was inappropriate and potentially violates several company policies. However, investigating this properly is going to take time, and it's going to involve interviewing multiple witnesses and reviewing Robert's conduct with other employees as well." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I also want you to know that filing this complaint takes courage, and regardless of what our investigation reveals, you did the right thing by bringing this to my attention. This kind of behavior, if it occurred as you've described, has no place in our workplace." The meeting lasted about 45 minutes total. Patricia explained the investigation process, assured me that there would be no retaliation for filing the complaint, and asked me to provide a written statement by the end of the week. She also mentioned that I should document any changes in how Robert treated me going forward, as well as any comments or reactions from other employees related to the incident. As I left her office, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. I'd taken the step I needed to take, but I also knew that the next few weeks were going to be complicated. Office dynamics were about to get very interesting, and I had no idea how things would ultimately play out. What I did know was that I wasn't going to let Robert's assessment of my potential become my reality. Whether I had a future at Redwood Financial or not, I was going to make sure that my career trajectory was determined by my work and abilities, not by one man's public attempt to diminish me.
The investigation was about to begin, and everything was about to change. The week following my meeting with Patricia felt like walking through a minefield. Every interaction at work carried extra weight. Every glance from a colleague made me wonder what they knew or suspected. I submitted my written statement to HR on Thursday, a detailed 3-page document that laid out the facts methodically and referenced specific company policies. Robert's behavior toward me shifted dramatically. Where before he'd been distant but professional, now he seemed almost friendly, stopping by my desk to ask about projects, complimenting my work and team meetings, even inviting me to grab coffee during our Tuesday morning department briefing. It was so transparent that Amanda started calling it the charm offensive. "He knows you filed a complaint," she said during lunch on Friday. "This is damage control." But the most telling moment came when Janet Morrison pulled me aside after our weekly marketing strategy meeting. Janet had been my mentor and advocate, the person who'd hinted about the director position, and someone I genuinely respected.
"Sarah, I need to ask you something directly," she said, closing her office door behind us. "Did you file a complaint about Robert with HR?" I'd prepared for this moment. "Janet, I can't discuss ongoing HR matters, but I can tell you that if someone had treated you the way I was treated at the holiday party, what would you have done?" She nodded slowly. "Robert came to see me yesterday. He wanted to know if I thought you were suited for advancement and whether I'd observed any performance issues with your work." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" I told him the truth, that you're one of the strongest analysts I've worked with, that the Richardson campaign was exceptional, and that I'd recommended you for the director position based on merit. She paused. "Sarah, he's building a case against you. Whatever you've set in motion with HR, he's trying to get ahead of it." That weekend, Patricia called me at home, something that immediately put me on edge. "Sarah, I need you to come in Monday morning, before regular business hours. Can you be here at 7 a.m.? Is everything okay? The investigation has uncovered some additional information, and I need to discuss it with you before we proceed further." Monday morning at 7 a.m., the office felt eerily quiet. Most of the cleaning crew had already left, and the early morning sunlight was just starting to filter through the large windows in the lobby. Patricia met me at the elevator, looking more serious than I'd ever seen her. "We need to talk in the conference room," she said, leading me down the hall to one of the larger meeting spaces usually reserved for client presentations. Inside the conference room, she had several folders spread across the table and what looked like printed emails stacked in neat piles. "Sarah, our investigation has revealed that you're not the first person to have issues with Robert's conduct," she began. "In fact, over the past 2 years, 3 other employees have filed complaints about his behavior, though none of them were as public or as severe as what happened at the holiday party." She opened one of the folders. 2 years ago, Michelle Crawford from the digital marketing team filed a complaint about Robert making comments about her appearance and questioning her commitment to her career after she announced her engagement. Last year, Kevin Walsh reported that Robert had undermined him in front of clients, specifically telling a client that Kevin wasn't ready for the big leagues during a project presentation. My mind was racing. I'd worked with both Michelle and Kevin, though neither had ever mentioned having problems with Robert. "What happened with those complaints?" I asked. Michelle left the company 6 months after filing her complaint. She said it was for a better opportunity, but her exit interview revealed that she felt the work environment had become hostile. Kevin transferred to our Denver office last spring. Patricia pulled out another folder, but here's what's really interesting. After you filed your complaint, I started digging deeper into Robert's management history. I discovered that his department has the highest turnover rate in the company, 60% higher than any other department. Most people cite seeking new challenges or better opportunities as their reason for leaving, but when I looked at the patterns, almost all of them were high-performing employees who left within 6 to 18 months of having direct conflicts with Robert. She showed me a chart she'd created, tracking employee departures from Robert's department over the past 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable. "Sarah, we also found something else.
Do you remember the Richardson Industries campaign that Robert praised you for publicly? Of course, that was my biggest success this year. Patricia pulled out a stack of printed emails. These are internal communications between Robert and Michael Harrison about that campaign. Robert took full credit for the strategy and implementation. He told Michael that you had assisted with some of the detailed work, but that the creative vision and client management were entirely his doing. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. That's completely false. I have documentation of every client meeting, every strategy session, every piece of creative development. I can prove that I led that project. I know you can. I've already reviewed your project files, and it's clear that Robert misrepresented your role to senior leadership. She paused. Sarah, what I'm about to tell you is confidential, but I think you deserve to know. Based on our investigation, the company is prepared to take disciplinary action against Robert. However, we need to handle this carefully because of his position and his relationship with some of our major clients. She explained that Robert had been placed under what they called administrative review, which meant his decisions were being monitored and his interactions with staff were being documented. More importantly, the company was conducting a broader review of the marketing department's operations and leadership structure.
What does this mean for the director position? I asked. That's actually why I wanted to meet with you this early. The company has decided to restructure the marketing department. Instead of promoting someone into a director role under Robert, they're creating a new position, Senior Marketing Manager, that would report directly to Michael Harrison rather than through Robert. My heart started beating faster. The position comes with a significant salary increase, broader responsibilities, and direct access to executive decision-making. You'd be managing the strategic accounts, leading the creative team, and essentially running the day-to-day operations of client-facing marketing initiatives. She slid a folder across the table to me. Sarah, based on your performance, your handling of this situation, and the recommendation of multiple colleagues, the company would like to offer you this position. I stared at the folder, not quite believing what I was hearing. There's more, Patricia continued. Robert is being reassigned to a consulting role focused on vendor relationships and industry partnerships. He'll no longer have direct reports or involvement in day-to-day marketing operations. It's essentially a lateral move that removes him from people management while allowing the company to retain his client relationships. The offer letter inside the folder outlined a salary increase of 35%, additional vacation time, profit-sharing eligibility, and a title that positioned me as one of the senior leaders in the company. I need to be clear about something, Patricia said. This isn't charity or compensation for what happened at the holiday party. The company has been planning this restructure for months, but your situation accelerated the timeline and made it clear that changes in leadership were necessary sooner rather than later. I looked up from the offer letter. What about retaliation? What's to stop Robert from making my work life difficult? Robert's new role will have minimal interaction with your responsibilities. More importantly, he's been made aware that any retaliatory behavior will result in immediate termination. The company has also implemented new policies around public feedback and employee communications that apply to all management staff. She leaned back in her chair. Sarah, I want you to understand something. What happened to you at that party was unacceptable, and it never should have occurred. But your response, the way you documented everything, approached HR professionally, and handled yourself throughout this process, that showed real leadership. That's part of why you're sitting here with this offer. I spent the rest of our meeting asking questions about the new role, the reporting structure, and the timeline for implementation. The position would begin in 2 weeks, giving the company time to announce the restructuring and handle the transition of Robert's current responsibilities. As I left the conference room that morning, I felt a mixture of vindication and surreal disbelief. 3 weeks earlier, Robert had publicly declared that I would never amount to anything significant at the company. Now I was being promoted to a position that made me one of the most senior marketing professionals in the organization. The irony wasn't lost on me, but more than that, I felt a sense of justice, not just for myself, but for Michelle, Kevin, and whoever else had been on the receiving end of Robert's toxic leadership over the years.
I accepted the offer that afternoon, and Patricia scheduled a company-wide announcement for the following Monday. The next 2 weeks were going to be interesting, but for the first time since the holiday party, I was looking forward to what came next. Robert had been right about one thing. This experience had definitely separated the wheat from the chaff. He just hadn't anticipated which category he'd end up in. 3 months into my new position, something unexpected happened that would change everything again. I was reviewing quarterly performance reports when my assistant, Maria Gonzalez, knocked on my office door with an expression I'd learned to recognize as important news. "Sarah, you have a visitor. Thomas Richardson is here, and he says it's urgent." Richardson rarely made unscheduled visits to our offices, preferring to handle most communication through phone calls and scheduled meetings. The fact that he'd driven across town without an appointment immediately put me on alert. "Thomas, what can I do for you?" I asked, as he settled into the chair across from my desk. He looked more serious than I'd ever seen him, and he was carrying a leather portfolio that he placed carefully on his lap. "Sarah, I'm here because I need to share some information that affects both our companies, and I felt this conversation needed to happen in person." He opened the portfolio and pulled out several documents. "Last week, I received a call from Derek Chen at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. Do you know that company?" I knew them well. Pinnacle was one of our biggest competitors in the Phoenix market, and they'd been aggressively trying to poach clients from several local agencies, including ours. Derek told me something very interesting. He said that Robert Sterling had approached them about a potential consulting arrangement that would involve sharing strategic information about Redwood Financial's client accounts, including proprietary campaign data and client contact information. My stomach dropped. What kind of consulting arrangement? Richardson pulled out what appeared to be a printed email chain. According to Derek, Robert claimed that he was being underutilized at Redwood Financial and was exploring opportunities to maximize his industry knowledge with other firms. The implication was that he could provide Pinnacle with inside information that would help them target your existing clients. I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was hearing. "Thomas, why are you telling me this instead of going directly to Michael Harrison?"
Because Derek Chen made it clear that Robert specifically mentioned your accounts, including our partnership with Richardson Industries. He seemed to think that clients who had worked primarily with you might be vulnerable to competitive offers, especially if they believed you lacked the senior leadership support necessary to maintain service quality. Richardson leaned forward in his chair. "Sarah, I've been in business for 25 years, and I've seen plenty of corporate politics and professional jealousy. But what Robert was proposing crossed the line from internal conflict into potential corporate espionage." He handed me copies of the email exchanges Derek had forwarded to him. Derek sent me these because he was uncomfortable with what Robert was suggesting. Apparently, Robert reached out to him shortly after the company restructuring was announced, claiming that Redwood Financial was in internal turmoil and that major clients would likely be looking for more stable partnerships. Reading through the emails, I could see that Robert had provided specific details about our client contracts, upcoming renewal dates, and even confidential information about pricing structures that only senior staff should have access to. "There's more," Richardson continued. Derek mentioned that Robert had contacted at least 3 other competing agencies with similar proposals. It seems like he was shopping around for the best offer. I immediately called Michael Harrison and asked him to join us in my office. When I explained the situation, Michael's expression went from confusion to concern to outright anger in the span of about 2 minutes. "Let me understand this correctly," Michael said, reviewing the documents. "Robert has been sharing confidential client information with our competitors, potentially violating his non-disclosure agreement and definitely violating company policy regarding proprietary information?" "That appears to be the case," Richardson confirmed, "and based on the timeline of these emails, this started happening within days of the departmental restructuring." Michael was quiet for several minutes, studying the email chains and making notes on his legal pad. Finally, he looked up at both of us. "Thomas, I cannot thank you enough for bringing this to our attention. This kind of information sharing could have severely damaged our competitive position and potentially put several client relationships at risk." He turned to me.
Sarah, I need you to immediately compile a list of all proprietary information that Robert would have had access to in his current role, including client contracts, pricing data, and strategic planning documents. The next few hours were a blur of urgent meetings, document reviews, and conference calls with our legal team. By the end of business that day, we'd discovered that Robert had accessed several client files that weren't related to his new responsibilities, had downloaded contact databases that he shouldn't have needed, and had been making copies of strategic planning documents from recent executive meetings. More troubling, we found evidence that he'd been building these files for weeks, possibly even before the restructuring was announced. It was starting to look less like a reaction to his new position and more like a premeditated plan to leverage confidential information for personal gain. The legal implications were serious. Corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of non-disclosure agreements could result in both civil and criminal charges. But beyond the legal issues, this situation represented a fundamental breach of trust that went far beyond anything we'd discovered during the original HR investigation. Tuesday morning, Robert was called into a meeting with Michael, Patricia, and the company's legal counsel. I wasn't present for that conversation, but Patricia later told me that Robert had initially denied any wrongdoing, then claimed he was simply exploring career options, and finally admitted that he'd shared some information but insisted it was nothing that would actually harm the company. By Wednesday, Robert Sterling was no longer employed by Redwood Financial Solutions. The company's official statement cited violations of confidentiality agreements and conduct incompatible with company values. But the full story was much more complicated. The legal team discovered that Robert had been in financial trouble for several months. His ex-wife had been seeking increased alimony payments, his mortgage was behind on payments, and he'd accumulated significant credit card debt. The consulting fees he'd been negotiating with competing agencies weren't just about professional revenge, they were about financial survival. This revelation actually made me feel somewhat sympathetic toward Robert, despite everything he'd put me through. Desperation can make people do things they would never consider under normal circumstances, and it was clear that his actions were driven by personal crisis as much as professional resentment. However, the damage to client relationships could have been catastrophic. Derek Chen at Pinnacle Marketing had forwarded Robert's proposals to two other clients, hoping to gather intelligence about Redwood Financial's vulnerabilities. If Thomas Richardson hadn't intervened when he did, we could have lost several major accounts to competitors who had been armed with our internal strategic information. The aftermath of Robert's termination led to some unexpected opportunities. Michael asked me to take on additional responsibilities, overseeing information security protocols and client relationship management across all departments. The company also implemented new policies around data access, document sharing, and competitive intelligence that positioned us as industry leaders in client confidentiality. More importantly, the way we'd handled the situation, with transparency, decisive action, and commitment to protecting client interests, actually strengthened several existing partnerships. Thomas Richardson recommended our services to two additional companies, specifically citing our integrity under pressure as a key factor in his endorsement. By the end of that week, I found myself in a position I could never have imagined 6 months earlier. Not only was I succeeding in the role that Robert had publicly declared I'd never be qualified for, but I was also being recognized as someone who could handle crisis management and strategic decision-making at the executive level. The irony wasn't lost on me that Robert's attempts to undermine my career had ultimately provided me with opportunities to demonstrate capabilities I didn't even know I possessed. His holiday party comments about my lack of leadership presence seemed particularly misguided in retrospect, considering that I was now managing one of the most sensitive corporate crises in the company's recent history. Amana summed it up perfectly during lunch that Friday. It's like he kept trying to prove you weren't leadership material, and every time he tried, you ended up in a more senior position than before. She was right. Robert's actions had inadvertently created a series of situations that allowed me to showcase skills in crisis management, strategic thinking, client relationship building, and ethical decision-making. Each challenge he'd presented had become a stepping stone to greater responsibility and recognition. As I settled into my expanded role, I realized that the holiday party incident had been just the beginning of a much larger story about workplace dynamics, personal integrity, and the unexpected ways that professional conflicts can reveal character, both in ourselves and in others. 6 weeks after Robert's termination, I thought the drama was finally behind us. I was wrong. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing campaign proposals when Maria buzzed my intercom with an edge in her voice that immediately got my attention. "Sarah, there's a reporter online too. She says she's calling about a workplace discrimination story involving Redwood Financial." My first instinct was to transfer the call to Patricia, but something made me pick up the phone directly. "This is Sarah Mitchell." "Ms. Mitchell, my name is Jennifer Walsh from Phoenix Business Weekly. I'm investigating allegations that Redwood Financial Solutions engaged in retaliatory practices against employees who filed workplace harassment complaints. Would you be willing to comment?" My blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, what are the allegations specifically?" "We've received information suggesting that the company's recent restructuring was designed to punish employees who had reported misconduct by senior managers, and that this resulted in unfair terminations and potential legal violations." I realized immediately what was happening. Robert hadn't simply disappeared after his termination, he was fighting back, and he'd found a way to reframe the entire story to make himself look like the victim. "Ms. Walsh, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the facts of the situation. I'd be happy to discuss this with you, but I'll need to coordinate with our legal department first." After hanging up, I immediately called Michael and Patricia. Within an hour, we were in an emergency meeting with our legal counsel, communications director, and the executive team. "It appears that Robert has hired an employment attorney and is claiming that his termination was retaliatory," explained our legal counsel, David Kim. "He's alleging that the company created a hostile work environment for him after Sarah filed her initial complaint, and that his eventual firing was part of a coordinated effort to silence him." Patricia looked incredulous. "He was fired for corporate espionage. We have documented evidence of him sharing confidential information with competitors." "His attorney is arguing that the espionage allegations were fabricated as a pretext to terminate him, and that his confidentiality violations were actually whistleblowing activities designed to expose the company's discriminatory practices." Michael rubbed his temples. "So he's claiming he was the victim of workplace harassment and that sharing our proprietary information with competitors was somehow justified as exposing discrimination?" "Essentially, yes. His attorney has filed a wrongful termination lawsuit and is seeking damages for lost income, emotional distress, and damage to his professional reputation. They've also filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission." The communications director, Lisa Chen, pulled out several printed articles from industry publications. "This story has already been picked up by 3 business journals, and Robert has given interviews claiming that Redwood Financial has a pattern of protecting young employees who make false accusations while punishing experienced managers who try to maintain professional standards." I felt sick reading the articles. Robert had completely reversed the narrative, portraying himself as a veteran manager who'd been destroyed by a vindictive subordinate and a company culture that prioritized political correctness over professional competence. Some of the quotes attributed to him were particularly galling.
Sarah Mitchell was consistently unable to meet the expectations of her position. One article quoted him as saying, "When I provided honest feedback about her performance limitations, she weaponized the HR process to retaliate against me for holding her accountable." In another interview, he claimed that the marketing department restructuring had been predetermined and that my complaint had simply provided a convenient excuse to implement changes that favored less experienced but more politically palatable employees. Lisa continued her briefing. "The most problematic aspect is that Robert's attorney has reached out to Michelle Crawford and Kevin Walsh, the former employees who had filed previous complaints. They're trying to build a case that the company has a pattern of pushing out senior employees who challenge the performance of younger staff members." David reviewed his legal notes. "The good news is that we have extensive documentation supporting our position. The confidentiality violations are clear, we have witnesses to Robert's inappropriate conduct, and we followed proper procedures throughout the investigation and termination process." "What's the bad news?" I asked. The bad news is that employment litigation can be unpredictable, and Robert's attorney is skilled at creating reasonable doubt about employer motivations. Even if we ultimately win, this process could take months and generate negative publicity that affects client relationships and company reputation. Over the next several days, I watched as the story gained traction in local business media. Several industry publications ran articles about workplace harassment allegations at Redwood Financial, and I started receiving concerned calls from clients asking about the management instability they were reading about. The most frustrating aspect was seeing how effectively Robert had manipulated the narrative. In his version of events, he was an experienced professional who'd been railroaded by a junior employee with connections to senior management, while the company was portrayed as either complicit in false accusations or incompetent in their handling of personnel matters. But then, something unexpected happened that changed everything. Derek Chen from Pinnacle Marketing Solutions called Michael directly and offered to provide testimony about Robert's attempts to share confidential information. More importantly, Derek had retained all of Robert's original communications, including several voicemails where Robert had explicitly discussed ways to damage Redwood Financial's competitive position in retaliation for his unfair treatment. "I've been following this story in the business journals," Derek told Michael during a conference call that I was invited to join. "What Robert proposed to us wasn't whistleblowing or legitimate business networking. He was clearly motivated by revenge, and he was willing to harm your client's interests to pursue it." Derek's willingness to go public with Robert's communications provided us with powerful evidence that contradicted the wrongful termination narrative. Robert hadn't been a conscientious employee trying to expose discrimination. He'd been a disgruntled former manager attempting to sabotage his previous employer's business relationships. Additionally, Thomas Richardson contacted several industry publications to provide his own perspective on the situation. As a respected business leader with no financial stake in the outcome, his endorsement of how Redwood Financial had handled the restructuring carried significant weight with journalists and industry observers. Sarah Mitchell is one of the most ethical and competent marketing professionals I've worked with in 25 years. Richardson told Phoenix Business Weekly in a follow-up interview, "The suggestion that she falsely accused anyone of misconduct is absurd to anyone who knows her character and work ethic." But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Michelle Crawford, one of the former employees Robert's attorney had contacted, decided to speak publicly about her own experiences with Robert's management style. Instead of supporting Robert's legal case, Michelle gave an interview to the Arizona Business Journal that corroborated the pattern of inappropriate behavior we'd documented. She described specific incidents where Robert had made unprofessional comments, undermined her work in front of clients, and created a hostile work environment that had ultimately driven her to leave the company. When I heard that Robert was claiming to be the victim of false accusations, I felt compelled to speak out, Michelle said in the published interview. "My experience with him was very similar to what I've read about Sarah's situation, and I think it's important that people understand the pattern of behavior that led to these complaints." Kevin Walsh also declined to support Robert's legal case, though he chose not to give public interviews about his experiences. As more evidence emerged supporting our position, and as Robert's credibility was undermined by his own communications and the testimony of former colleagues, the media narrative began to shift. Articles that had initially presented the story as potential corporate discrimination were updated with new information about Robert's documented misconduct and attempted corporate espionage. The wrongful termination lawsuit continued, but Robert's attorney was now facing a much more difficult case. The EEOC complaint was also becoming problematic for Robert's side, as the evidence clearly supported the company's contention that his termination was based on legitimate policy violations rather than retaliatory discrimination. By the end of March, what had started as a potential crisis for the company had become a demonstration of our commitment to ethical business practices and employee protection. Several new clients had approached us specifically because they'd been impressed with how we'd handled both the internal personnel issues and the external legal challenges. The irony was striking. Once again, Robert's attempts to damage my career and the company's reputation had backfired spectacularly. His legal strategy had actually provided us with opportunities to publicly demonstrate the integrity and professionalism that had made our business successful in the first place.
But more than that, the entire experience had revealed something important about workplace dynamics and professional accountability. Sometimes, the people who talk the most about maintaining standards and professional competence are the ones who understand those concepts the least. 2 months later, in early May, I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly performance metrics when Patricia knocked on my door with news that would put everything into perspective. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with David Kim. Robert's attorney wants to schedule a settlement conference. Apparently, they're interested in resolving this matter out of court." The lawsuit had been grinding through the legal system for weeks, with depositions, document discovery, and increasingly expensive legal fees on both sides. But more importantly for Robert, his public campaign to portray himself as a victim had completely collapsed once Derek Chen and Michelle Crawford had gone on record with their experiences. "What kind of settlement are they proposing?"
Patricia sat down and opened her folder. They're essentially asking for a face-saving exit. Robert would drop the wrongful termination lawsuit and the EOC complaint in exchange for a neutral employment reference and an agreement that both parties won't make public statements about the case. I was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything that had transpired over the past 6 months. What does David recommend? From a legal standpoint, we could probably win at trial. We have strong evidence, credible witnesses, and Robert's own communications contradict his legal claims. But litigation is expensive and unpredictable, and settling would allow us to close this chapter definitively. That afternoon, Michael called me into his office for a broader conversation about the situation and its impact on the company. "Sarah, before we make any decisions about settlement, I want to discuss something with you. This entire experience has revealed a lot about your leadership capabilities and your value to the organization." He pulled out what looked like a formal document from his desk drawer. "The board of directors met last week to discuss the marketing department's performance and the way we've handled this crisis. They were particularly impressed with your professionalism throughout this process and your ability to maintain client relationships despite the external pressures." Michael handed me the document. "We'd like to offer you the position of Vice President of Marketing and Client Relations. It comes with a significant salary increase, equity participation, and a seat on the company's executive committee." I stared at the offer letter, hardly believing what I was reading. 6 months earlier, I'd been a senior analyst whom Robert had publicly declared would never amount to anything significant. Now the company was offering me a vice president role that would make me one of the youngest executives in the organization's history. "Michael, I'm honored, but I have to ask, is this offer related to the legal situation with Robert?" "Not at all. This promotion is based on performance metrics, client feedback, and strategic value to the organization. Your handling of the Richardson Industries expansion, the successful launch of 3 major campaigns, and the improvement in departmental productivity since the restructuring, those accomplishments speak for themselves." He leaned back in his chair. "The legal situation actually just confirmed what we were already seeing in your work. Leaders aren't defined by how they perform when everything is going smoothly. They're defined by how they handle adversity, maintain their integrity under pressure, and continue delivering results despite external distractions." That evening, Amanda and I met for dinner to discuss the settlement offer and the promotion. Over appetizers, she brought up something that had been on my mind as well. "Do you think Robert ever imagined that his comments at the holiday party would lead to all of this?" I considered the question while picking at my salad. I think he saw me as an easy target, someone junior enough that publicly undermining me would demonstrate his authority without any real consequences. But instead, it exposed patterns of behavior that the company couldn't ignore once they started looking. Exactly. And then every subsequent action he took, the charm offensive, the attempts at corporate espionage, the frivolous lawsuit, just made things worse for him, while creating more opportunities for me to prove myself. Amanda raised her wine glass. "So, what are you going to do about the settlement?" I'd been thinking about this decision all afternoon. On one hand, letting Robert walk away with a neutral reference felt like he was getting off easy for behavior that had potentially damaged multiple careers over the years. On the other hand, continuing the legal battle would consume time and energy that I'd rather invest in growing the business and building my new role. "I think I'm going to recommend that we accept the settlement, but with one modification.
What kind of modification? I want Robert to agree to participate in a professional development program focused on management skills and workplace conduct, not as punishment, but as a genuine attempt to help him understand why his approach to leadership was problematic. The next morning, I discussed this idea with Patricia and David Kim. They were initially skeptical about adding conditions to the settlement, but when I explained my reasoning, they agreed it was worth proposing. My concern isn't about revenge or making Robert suffer, I told them. It's about preventing future employees from going through what Michelle, Kevin, and I experienced. If Robert is going to continue working in management positions elsewhere, he needs to understand why his behavior was harmful and develop better approaches to leadership. David nodded thoughtfully. It's an unusual request, but it demonstrates the kind of forward-thinking leadership that got you promoted in the first place. When Robert's attorney heard our counterproposal, his initial reaction was predictably negative. But after discussing it with Robert, they agreed to the condition. Apparently, Robert was eager enough to end the legal proceedings that he was willing to participate in management training as part of the settlement.
The final settlement agreement was signed in mid-May. Robert dropped all legal claims, agreed to the professional development program, and both parties committed to maintaining confidentiality about the specific details of his departure. The company provided a neutral employment reference, confirming his dates of employment and job titles without commentary on performance or circumstances of departure. More importantly for me, the settlement marked the end of a chapter that had transformed my career in ways I could never have anticipated. At the settlement conference, Robert and I spoke briefly for the first time since his termination. He approached me during a break in the proceedings. "Sarah, I want you to know that I don't harbor any personal animosity toward you. This whole situation got out of hand, and I probably handled things poorly. It wasn't exactly a full apology, but it was more accountability than I'd expected. Robert, I hope the management training program is helpful. You have valuable industry experience, and I think you could be successful if you approach leadership differently." He looked surprised by my response. "I appreciate that. And for what it's worth, you've clearly proven that my assessment of your potential was completely wrong." 3 weeks later, I was officially promoted to Vice President of Marketing and Client Relations. The announcement was made at the company's quarterly all-hands meeting, and the response from colleagues was overwhelmingly positive. Janet Morrison, who had been my mentor throughout this entire experience, pulled me aside after the meeting. "Sarah, I've been in this industry for 20 years, and I've never seen someone turn a hostile situation into such a positive outcome. You didn't just survive Robert's attempts to undermine you, you used each challenge as an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that might have taken years to showcase otherwise." She was right. The holiday party incident had been the catalyst, but the real transformation had come through how I'd chosen to respond to each subsequent challenge. Instead of becoming bitter or defensive, I'd focused on documentation, professional development, and maintaining high performance standards despite the external drama. Looking back, Robert's prediction that I would never amount to anything significant at the company had become a self-defeating prophecy. His attempts to limit my career advancement had actually accelerated it by creating situations where I could demonstrate leadership skills under pressure. The settlement was finalized, the lawsuit was dismissed, and Robert Sterling became a closed chapter in both my career and the company's history. But the lessons from that experience about workplace dynamics, personal integrity, and the importance of standing up for professional standards would influence my approach to leadership for years to come. 1 year later, I was standing in the exact same ballroom at the Grand Canyon Resort where this entire story had begun. But this time, instead of being on the receiving end of public humiliation, I was giving the keynote speech at the Phoenix Business Excellence Award ceremony. The irony wasn't lost on me as I looked out at an audience of nearly 400 business leaders, many of whom had witnessed or heard about Robert's comments at last year's holiday party. Tonight, I was receiving the Rising Executive of the Year award, and my speech topic was turning professional challenges into career opportunities. Exactly 12 months ago, I was at a company event where someone told me I would never amount to anything significant in my career. Tonight,
I want to talk about what happened next and why that moment became the best thing that ever happened to my professional development. The audience was immediately engaged, leaning forward in their seats as I recounted the journey from that humiliating December evening to this moment of recognition. But before I get to the lessons I learned, let me update you on how this story affected everyone involved. Redwood Financial Solutions had experienced its best year in company history. Our client retention rate was 96%. We'd expanded into 2 new markets, and the marketing department I now led had been recognized by the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce for innovative campaign development. The Richardson Industries partnership had grown into a multi-million-dollar relationship, and Thomas Richardson had personally recommended our services to 8 other companies. More importantly, the workplace culture changes we'd implemented after the initial HR investigation had created an environment where employees felt more comfortable reporting concerns and more confidence about career advancement opportunities. Our employee satisfaction scores had increased by 32%, and voluntary turnover had dropped to the lowest levels in the company's history. Michael Harrison had been promoted to regional president, overseeing operations in 3 states, and he'd asked me to join his executive leadership team. The crisis management skills I developed during the legal proceedings had proven valuable in several subsequent client situations, and I was now regularly consulted on complex business relationship issues across multiple departments.
Amanda Torres had been promoted to accounting manager and had become my closest advisor on strategic planning initiatives. Janet Morrison had taken over as Director of Professional Development, using her mentoring experience to create formal career advancement programs for other employees. Patricia Kim had been recognized by the Society for Human Resource Management for her innovative approaches to workplace conflict resolution, and she'd been invited to speak at conferences about creating accountability structures that protect both employees and organizations. As for Robert Sterling, the management training program had apparently been more effective than anyone had anticipated. 3 months after completing the professional development requirements, he'd been hired as a strategic consultant by a Denver-based marketing firm. According to industry contacts, he was performing well in a role that utilized his client relationship skills without requiring direct employee supervision. More surprisingly, Robert had reached out to me 6 months after the settlement to share something unexpected. He'd been attending ongoing leadership coaching sessions and had gained perspective on how his management approach had affected the people who worked for him. "Sarah," he'd said during our brief phone conversation, "I want you to know that the training program made me realize things about my leadership style that I'd never recognized before. I'm grateful that you suggested it as part of the settlement instead of just wanting to see me punished." It was a conversation I'd never expected to have, but it reinforced something I'd learned throughout this entire experience. Most workplace conflicts aren't really about good people versus bad people. They're about different approaches to communication, authority, and professional relationships that sometimes create destructive patterns. Robert's public humiliation of me hadn't been motivated by malice. It had been motivated by insecurity about his own position and outdated ideas about how to demonstrate leadership authority. His subsequent actions had been driven by desperation and fear rather than genuine malevolence. Understanding that didn't excuse his behavior, but it helped me develop a more nuanced perspective on workplace dynamics. During my keynote speech that evening, I outlined 5 principles that had guided me through the crisis and continue to influence my approach to leadership. First, document everything. Not because you're planning to file complaints or lawsuits, but because clear documentation helps you understand patterns, make better decisions, and communicate more effectively when conflicts arise. The time I'd spent writing down exactly what Robert had said and when he'd said it had been crucial to every subsequent step in the process. Second, focus on performance rather than politics. Throughout the entire situation, my primary concern had been continuing to deliver excellent work for clients and maintaining professional standards. That focus had protected me from getting drawn into personal conflicts and had provided concrete evidence of my value to the organization. Third, seek solutions rather than revenge. My goal had never been to destroy Robert's career or to punish him for his behavior. My goal had been to create a work environment where I could succeed and contribute effectively. That solution-focused approach had led to outcomes that benefited everyone, including Robert, ultimately.
Fourth, build relationships based on mutual respect and shared goals. The support I'd received from colleagues like Amanda, Janet, and clients like Thomas Richardson hadn't been because they felt sorry for me. It had been because we'd built professional relationships based on trust, competence, and shared commitment to excellence. Fifth, use challenges as opportunities to demonstrate capabilities you might not otherwise be able to showcase. The crisis management skills, strategic thinking, and leadership abilities that had earned me the VP position had all been developed in response to the challenges Robert's behavior had created. After the award ceremony, several young professionals approached me to share their own stories about workplace conflicts and career obstacles. Many of them were dealing with situations similar to what I'd experienced: managers who undermined their confidence, colleagues who took credit for their work, or organizational cultures that seemed to favor certain types of employees over others. The conversations reminded me why I'd been so determined to handle my situation professionally rather than just walking away or retaliating emotionally. Workplace harassment and toxic leadership affect countless people, but most of those situations never get resolved effectively because people either don't know how to address them systematically or don't believe that challenging authority figures can lead to positive outcomes. 3 days after the award ceremony, I received an email that surprised me more than anything else that had happened during this entire journey. It was from Michelle Crawford, the former employee who had corroborated my experiences with Robert's management style during the legal proceedings. "Sarah," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that watching how you handled your situation with Robert gave me the courage to address a similar problem at my current company. I followed your approach: documentation, professional communication with HR, focus on solutions rather than complaints, and the result was a complete restructuring of our department that has made the workplace much more positive for everyone." She continued, "More importantly, I've been promoted to senior manager, and I'm now in a position to mentor other employees who are dealing with difficult supervisors. Your example showed me that standing up for professional standards doesn't have to be career suicide. It can actually be career advancement if you approach it strategically." Michelle's email crystallized something I'd been thinking about since the award ceremony. The most significant outcome of my experience hadn't been the promotions, the salary increases, or the professional recognition. It has been the realization that individual actions can create positive changes that extend far beyond personal career advancement. By challenging Robert's behavior through proper channels and maintaining professional standards throughout the process, I hadn't just improved my own work situation, I'd contributed to cultural changes that would benefit future employees, established precedents for addressing workplace conflicts, and demonstrated that ethical leadership can be more effective than authoritarian management. As I write this, 2 years have passed since that holiday party where Robert Sterling told me I would never amount to anything significant. I'm now Vice President of Marketing and Client Relations at one of Phoenix's fastest-growing financial services companies. I'm serving on the board of directors for the local chapter of Women in Business, and I'm regularly invited to speak at conferences about leadership development and workplace culture. But more than the professional achievements, I'm proud of the way this experience shaped my approach to leadership and mentoring. I now manage a team of 12 marketing professionals, and I'm committed to creating an environment where people feel supported, challenged, and valued for their contributions. The lesson I've learned is that sometimes the people who try to limit your potential end up revealing capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Robert's attempts to undermine my career had forced me to develop skills in crisis management, strategic communication, and ethical leadership that I might never have discovered in a more comfortable work environment. That December evening when he humiliated me in front of half the company, Robert Sterling thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he set in motion a series of events that helped me find my place as a leader, as a professional, and as someone who refuses to let other people's limitations define her possibilities. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you professionally becomes the best thing that ever happened to your career. You just have to be willing to turn challenges into opportunities, setbacks into comebacks, and criticism into motivation. That's what I did, and that's my story. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.